taken over the presentation now. So I just want to talk about some of the key actors and a little bit about this presentation. So as a group, we are addressing issues with regards to photography abroad. We're looking at the ways in which photography, as a medium and form of global engagement, can be done ethically and unethically. The types of actions involved are anything from formal, professional photographers engaging in global engagement opportunities through to young people posting their experiences on social media. Our strategy for global engagement tool is focusing on young people who are posting their experiences to social media. The key stakeholders in this form of global engagement are the young people posting the photos and the individuals who are being photographed and whose photo is being shared across the internet. Some possible motivations for this kind of global engagement in sharing photos to social media could be wanting to show how an individual is making a difference. Perhaps a young person might share a photo of the poverty they are witnessing without thinking about how that photo could impact those living there. The young person could be doing so because they think this is helping by spreading awareness, so it could come from an altruism motive. Now, an interesting thing that should be considered is what was learned in Module 10 of this course. We studied Eliza Morales' image analysis framework. It suggests that every photo that is shared within any kind of global engagement experience context should be considered within some representational conventions. As you can see here, we have three listed, which is the first one, exoticization, as well as exclusion and cultural appropriation. Now, the first representational convention that we're going to talk about is exoticization. So it is defined as the conversion of something into a more exotic form. It's the representation of something ordinary as being exotic, or the act of romanticizing elements of something, like a culture that is foreign to oneself. So, for example, representing image subjects is a different form from the typically white photographer rather than similar. Or it's giving an impression that travel to the Global South is exciting, adventurous, and new. It's suggesting that the Global South is a location for Westerners to see strange new things and discover themselves. The second one we're looking at is exclusion. Exclusion is defined as the process or state of excluding or being excluded. The absence or exclusion of the host community from images and publication process. The volunteers and Westerners dominate images. Now, the third analysis framework that we're looking at is cultural appropriation. So this is defined as adoption or use of elements of one culture, typically a marginalized culture, by members of a different culture, typically a dominant culture. So, for example, depicting Westerners wearing, using, or engaging in aspects of a different culture without acknowledgement of existing histories of power dynamics at play. The second one we're looking at is exclusion. Exclusion is defined as the process or state of excluding or being excluded. It's the absence or exclusion of the host community from images and publication process. Volunteers and Westerners dominate images. Now, the third analysis framework that we're looking at is cultural appropriation. So this is defined as adoption or use of elements of one culture, typically a marginalized culture, by members of a different culture, typically a dominant culture. So, for example, depicting Westerners wearing, using, or engaging in aspects of a different culture without acknowledgement of existing histories of power dynamics at play. Now, the next framework that we're looking at is the white savior narrative. This is a media trope where images convey white characters as heroes, helpers, or saviors. It's creating a story of linear aid, with the Westerner handing down aid to a passive recipient. Another one we're looking at is disempowerment. It's to make a person or group less powerful or confident. Often it's a portrayal of a host community as passive recipients of products or services rather than equal participants in a cultural exchange. It's not allowing the people depicted the opportunity to accurately represent themselves and become empowered. Now our final one we're looking at is misrepresentation. Misrepresentation is not accurately telling the story of those depicted. It's creating a false idea of life in the global south and the lives of marginalized, vulnerable, and or poor people.
Hi, I'm Sarah, and I'm going to be taking over from Zoe and talking a little bit about the ethical issues at play when it comes to this kind of photography. We have talked about imagery in this course regarding travel abroad, tourism abroad, voluntourism, volunteering, and work abroad. What we'd like to tackle with our tool and in this presentation is people, particularly young people, sharing photos on social media portraying their experiences in the global south and how a lot of this imagery can be problematic. We are not going to be focusing on the marketing of travel abroad programs. We're going to be focusing on individuals sharing their personal photos of their own experiences. Now, how did this ethical issue come to be? Is there a history associated with this kind of imagery? Yes, there is. We can start with the colonial period. The first people entering colonial spaces from the West being missionaries and explorers. And a lot of the photos that they sent home to the West were attempting to convey these new places as harmless and the people there as inferior. There was a lot of social Darwinism at play, and so these missionaries and explorers took photos and shared photos that portrayed them as socially superior to host communities and local people, and that might be them standing over local people, looking down on them, and so on. And then we move into missionaries and volunteers in the 19th and 20th century. And these people, a lot of the missionaries, viewed themselves as helpers and the people that they were helping as helpless. And this came across in the imagery that they shared and sent home as well. Now, moving to today, what we'd like to tackle is social media, which has made sharing images and information so much easier than back in the colonial period as it relates to people sharing their experiences in the global south. We've talked about the motivations behind global engagement in general in this course, but we'd like to identify here the possible motivations behind not just engaging in travel and tourism and work and volunteering in the global south, but sharing images related to these experiences. We've talked in Module 4 about the concept of global citizenship and that many people feel a moral obligation to aid people around the world, not necessarily understanding the impact on stakeholders. We've discussed how the concept of global citizenship is often viewed through only one lens, which would be the Western one. And connecting it to photography, these photos shared and being viewed through the Western lens and Western understanding of global citizenship may be viewed as inspirational, and someone who has engaged in an experience abroad in the global south may share these photos because they feel that they're inspirational, or they might be an attempt on the part of the traveler to understand themselves and portray themselves as altruistic. Speaking of altruism, some people may participate in voluntourism or similar travel abroad experiences with positive, although perhaps misguided, intentions, and they may post these images of people or children they volunteered and interacted with simply to share their experiences. In 2013, when I was 16, I traveled to Ghana for 2 weeks to participate in a volunteer program. I can look back on the experience now, being a DEVS student studying international development and participating in this course, and I can understand that my time there was problematic and more impactful for me than it was for the people of the host community. I can look at my motivations, and while I did like the idea of helping people and being altruistic, I would say that my probably major motivations for embarking on the trip were selfish in nature and self-serving, and that I was looking to discover myself and understand myself, and I was looking for an exciting experience. And so I can relate to people sharing these images, as that was my Facebook feed when I returned from this trip when I was 16. I can now understand, by looking through a critical lens, how problematic that was. But I can also understand how, if someone doesn't have knowledge of the subject and knowledge of their positionality necessarily, they can make this mistake. Another motivation that people might have for posting pictures is the idea of travel and adventure. Exoticism plays into this, things being new and strange and different in the global south, focusing on differences rather than similarities. People may post pictures of them engaging with people of the global south and of host communities so that they can portray themselves as adventurous and exciting and world travelers. Now, with celebrities, we often talk about branding, although we can also talk about branding as it relates to social media, whether social media accounts have lots of followers or whether people are sharing photos for their friends and family to see. Participation in something like voluntourism and sharing those photos may be used to build that person's perception in the public eye or their personal brand. They may want to change the way that people, friends and family, or followers on social media view them. Now we have to ask, how are the stakeholders impacted by the sharing of this imagery? When we think about the people who are taking the photos or who are the subject of the photo and are having someone take it for them, we can connect their benefits and the impacts of sharing these photos to their motivations. People may view them as more altruistic. It may help their brand. The images may convince people that they are a global citizen or that they're adventurous and world travelers. When we're talking about stakeholders being the people who are portrayed in the images, the host communities, the people of the global south, a lot of the time these images contribute to disempowerment. They're taking agency away from the people who are being portrayed rather than supporting those people's agency. When you look at some of these photos and what they literally portray, a lot of the time it's people of these host communities passively receiving aid from a white person, for instance, which is showing them without agency. And these photographs can also disempower these people after the photo is taken. For instance, do the people portrayed in these photos have control over how they are represented, how their photos are shared and explained? Are they able to, for instance, comment on a Facebook post of their picture and provide context and enter a discussion about the photo? I would say typically no. These photos can also encourage stereotypes which may be harmful. Stereotypes such as people of the global south are sad and helpless and passive recipients of aid from white Westerners. Now, these stereotypes that these photos can encourage affect discourse concerning aid and development in the global south, which in turn affects people's attitudes towards those subjects and their actions. These photos can encourage forms of global engagement that harm more than they help. For instance, if someone engages in a short-term volunteer trip, which is probably more harmful than helpful, and shares photos on Facebook or Instagram, it could encourage others to participate in similar kinds of experiences. Finally, these photos can reinforce power dynamics, such as the idea that there is a wealthy Westerner versus a poor and underprivileged person, and then can, in particular and specifically, reinforce racialized power relations. White Westerners as the givers of aid and racialized groups as receivers of that aid. When we think about what we've learned from scholars on this issue, we will talk mainly about an article from Ellen Klost in Chapter 12 of our textbook titled Visual Representation and Canadian Government-Funded Volunteer Abroad Programs, Picturing the Canadian Global Citizen. And while this article is focusing mainly on the marketing of travel abroad programs funded by the Canadian government, a lot of what Klost is talking about is also very relevant to what we're discussing. She writes, I suggest that as Northerners, Westerners, working in the Global South, our paths are always linked with the colonial past, but are seldom discussed. What I take from this is that, for instance, a white person taking a picture with a local person in their host community, that traveler is linked to the colonial past of that place. They are linked to the oppression of the local community there. They're coming from a society which has been linked to the oppression of those people, but do not necessarily recognize that and recognize their positionality, and that's very problematic to me. It's misrepresenting history and relationships. Now, Klost also tells us that the photographer maintains control over the distribution and interpretation of an image, as well as the context with which it is presented. The photographer might not provide important context to understand the photo and the way people are behaving in the photo, and they're more than likely not going to provide context which would allow viewers to understand the experience of the people that they have portrayed in the images. Many photographs also position white Western women as the caregivers of children and vulnerable people in the Global South, and Klost talked about the volunteer Madonna imagery. The problem with this is that if we're portraying these white Western women as the caregivers of these children and vulnerable people, then we're assuming that the mothers and the caregivers in the Global South are absent, which is not accurate. Also, people are not ready or expected often to look at images through a critical lens. Now, particularly when we're talking about images shared through social media, people who are scrolling through Facebook or Instagram are probably not in the frame of mind or expecting to look at an image through a critical lens. They might not have the knowledge base to look at that image and understand how to criticize it, or that they should criticize it. And people who are posting an image on Facebook aren't expecting for people to discuss it through a critical lens. They're not expecting to see a comment about the way that people of the Global South are portrayed in that photo. And the culture of social media doesn't encourage that kind of discussion. Finally, Klost writes that these photos often support a structure of binaries: white versus non-white, helper versus helpless, powerful versus powerless, etc. And the reality is that binaries are harmful, particularly as a function of Orientalism and Orientalist discourse. And the fact is that the real world doesn't exist in binaries. So this kind of imagery that supports binaries is inaccurate and can spread inaccurate and harmful ideas. Now we're going to move to Latiana's part of the presentation, where she's going to present the tool that we've created.